Welcome, everybody. On behalf of the Center for Brain Health, I want to welcome you to our Frontiers of Brain Health, where we take a deep dive into novel discoveries in the fascinating area of cognitive neuroscience. My name is Stephen White. I'm not a researcher here, but I do have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Center for Brain Health. And I just want to give you a few house rules before I introduce Dr. Cook. First of all, we will have a few minutes at the end for Q&A, so I will be monitoring some of the virtual Q&A, and we'll also be handling questions from the audience today. So thanks for being here. We will be, this is recorded, so just be mindful of that as we proceed. And for those of you who don't know much about the Center for Brain Health, literally for the past 30 years, we're actually celebrating our 25th formal anniversary this year, but we've been focused on looking at the brain in health. And what's informed a lot of that was some of our early discoveries in working with a variety of individuals, young and old, with traumatic brain injury, whether athletes, military, and the like. But we've really focused on really the brain's amazing ability to get better with simple tools and strategies. And let me turn to Dr. Cook. So in the audience, let me see who enjoyed the little precursor music, number one. And number two, does anyone care to guess who that band was? Samantha. Right. So for those of you from the virtual audience, we were playing Jesus Jones right here, right now, because there is no place I'd rather be than to be here listening to Dr. Cook. Dr. Lori Cook has really spent her entire career here and has touched almost every novel discovery we've had here. And she's really been focused on discovering the impact of traumatic brain injury in youth, how we train youth, their special needs, kind of the nuances. And she's going to be sharing a lot of those discoveries and insights with us today. I looked up her resume. I was going to share some of her publications, but we'd be here for the entire hour doing that. Suffice to say, very well respected, has published dozens of peer-reviewed research articles, very well defended, very well documented. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lori Cook, who's going to talk to us about the 3 R's of promoting reasoning, and this is what's really practical, real-life function, and resilience in adolescents after TBI, which is traumatic brain injury. I'll turn it over to Dr. Cook.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve, for that introduction and for the music bringing us into our talk today on this beautiful spring day in Dallas. And thank you to all of those joining us virtually as well. It's truly a pleasure to get to speak to one of my favorite topics, which is really supporting youth after brain injury. This is something that's been a passion of mine and been involved in this work for over 20 years now here at the Center for Brain Health. And to give you the general overview of what I intend to speak to today, one, I want to make sure that y'all come away with a good sense for why we are talking about pediatric traumatic brain injury. So in other words, what is the impact of an injury on the developing brain? Secondly, what have we learned through research, through clinical practice that's advanced our brain-based approaches to assessment and treatment for these kids? And then lastly, really where we are today, how are we implementing or applying strategy-based approaches to equip these incredible youth with skills that they can use to support resilience in the long run? And really just to boil it down for you in the interest of presenting my bottom line up front, here's what I really hope you walk away with today. One, this idea that kids are not just quote unquote little adults, and I will definitely elaborate on that. Two, if we think about, for example, pediatric cancer and this idea of wanting to make sure that they continue to stay in remission, we need a similar model for our youth with traumatic brain injury. In other words, there's quite a need and also a real hope that can be set in motion by providing follow-up, monitoring, and support across the lifespan for these youth. And then lastly, and I will elaborate a lot on this, but strategies are for real life. And that is so important as we think of promoting brain change and influencing and supporting function. And I'm also going to challenge you in the spirit of practicing what I preach. I would love for you all to consider too, what are your own take-home messages? So kind of coming into this discussion with that charge in mind, and at the end, of course, I'll keep it open, allow some time for questions, but I encourage you, if you do have a question, and if you're comfortable, please share what are your take-home messages as well. I always learn so much from hearing others' perspectives as you're taking in this information. So let's get rolling, and starting with that quick discussion on the impact of injury on the developing brain. So first off, we've already been using the acronym a lot. TBI, it stands for traumatic brain injury. What is that? Well, the classic definition is what I have here. Really the idea that a TBI is an injury to the brain that's caused by a force upon the brain. So that could be caused by a bump, a blow, a jolt to the head, in some cases a penetrating head injury like a bullet, for example, to the head, something that's going to disrupt the normal function of the brain. It's also important, though, in this discussion, I think especially with youth and brain injury, to help you understand that there can be kind of two sides to this story, or two kind of aspects of this range of severity. One would be talking about our kids who experience those more moderate to severe injuries. So, typical causes may be being in a motor vehicle accident or having a fall from a high place, for example. On the lower end of severity would be our mild TBIs, also commonly known as concussion. And of course, this is a word that most of us can relate to, maybe even have experience with firsthand, has really increased in terms of awareness in the public discourse lately. So I will be speaking essentially to the full spectrum, but a particular emphasis on those more moderate to severe injuries as we look at that need for long-term support. So again, why study brain injury in kids? Why is this distinct from adults, for example? Well, as we look at the prevalence, you'll see a lot of different statistics, and one reason for all the variability is I don't think we really have a true handle on how many injuries are actually happening. One common figure is to see that 1 in 30 kids will sustain a brain injury before age 21, but actual prevalence figures, when we take into account, for example, going all the way down to birth, all the way up to those injuries that may not be seeking, kind of classic medical care or being seen in hospitals, those figures may be as high as 1 in 3 kids being impacted by brain injury. Of course, the majority of those likely being mild or concussion type injuries. In fact, some recent data, in 2019, there was a report that about 15% of all U.S. high school students self-reported having 1 or even more sports or recreation-related concussions just within the past year. So again, this is an issue that impacts many, many kids and families. When we look at risk groups, in particular, the 2 age groups that are at the highest risk for injury are our youngest kiddos, our 0 to 4-year-olds, but then also our teenagers, our adolescents, especially those within that kind of 15 to 19-year age range. For our young kiddos, the causes most typically are falls. For those teenagers, especially for these moderate to severe injuries, we're talking motor vehicle accidents. And then, of course, on the mild side, our sports and recreation-related injuries as well. But something that a lot of people don't know is that TBI, traumatic brain injury, it actually is the leading cause of death and disability among children in the U.S. And again, it's been interesting to see that awareness grow, but I think still a lot of room for that knowledge. interestingly, about 10 years ago, there was a big study that came out in the Journal of the American Medical Association that really brought this awareness into the public discourse. What they found, just looking at a small time period, in their case between 2006, 2010, they actually saw that the rate of emergency room or emergency department visits for individuals with TBI increased 30% just in that time range. And to give a point of comparison on this graph, the bottom line are just general emergency department visits. So you could see they were increasing visits specifically for TBI at a rate 8 times higher than that of just general emergency room visits. And again, some of the biggest increases were in our very young kiddos, and in this case, even some of our older adults, a lot of those being driven again by fall type injuries. Another group that looked at a kind of in this similar time range, but a few more years there, actually found a 60% increase in emergency department visits for those concussion injuries among youth. So all that being said, we are certainly seeing, an increased, not necessarily incidence so much as awareness, right? People are aware now that this is something that needs to be addressed. They're seeking care for more and more folks in the medical system for brain injury. Now, when we think of those kids whose injuries really warrant hospitalization, so again, typically our kids that are going to be more those moderate to severe injuries, oftentimes these young people may have to spend days to weeks in the hospitals they're recovering, especially if these are injuries that yielded, loss of consciousness, coma. They may have to spend several weeks in various stages of rehabilitation and support. Typically when they're discharged, some recommendations are made to the schools, but generally speaking, oftentimes once those kids are out of the medical system back into the community, there's not a lot of additional follow-up care. And in fact, this has become such a prominent pattern, if you will. About 5 years ago, a group of researchers, providers, clinicians from around the country came together, and the CDC, in fact, published a report to Congress about the management of TBI in kids in the US and really looking at opportunities for action. So identifying gaps in care, kind of lack of coordination or continuity. Their take-home message was that, one, management of TBI, it's complex, it's not straightforward. We often say, you see one brain injury, you've seen one brain injury. In other words, each person is unique. Therefore, each person's recovery and needs are also unique. So our delivery systems are not really providing that coordinated care that's really critical for ensuring successful recovery in the long term. So again, identifying those opportunities, moving forward and improving our systems is happening, but a lot of progress still to be made. Here at the Center for Brain Health, again, I've been really fortunate to be involved in the research in brain injury we've been doing here for well over 20 years now, and this is largely under the guidance and mentorship of our founder and chief director, Dr. Sandy Chapman. She was one of the first to really pioneer the emphasis and the value of supporting kids in the long term. So really looking beyond that hospital stage into that community and school growing up stages of life. So in fact, I love this quote of hers where she said, we really need to consider treating TBI as a chronic condition. So of course that acute recovery and care is essential, but equally important is long-term monitoring, effective interventions. There's so much that we can do to be proactive, to mitigate challenges that are persisting or even deficits that might come up down the road. So to take a bird's eye view when it comes to brain injury research, really across the field, early emphasis was on identification and monitoring, right? Let's get a handle on the problem. Let's make sure that kids are identified, are not falling through any cracks, that they're getting care. And then a lot of the emphasis shifted to, okay, now what can we do to facilitate recovery, remediation, which is important work still continuing. But we're also seeing this new frontier I like to call resilience building. Think about this. It's a phrase we use a lot here at the center. What could we do to be left of boom? In other words, what could we do before the impact even happens, just in all of us, to put our brains in a better place, to build resilience. I think athletes have a really good concept of this. If you think about, resilience training to help make them less vulnerable to knee injury, for example. Are there parallels when we consider the brain? So building resilience physically, mentally, and so forth. So just to give a quick listing of some of the research that's driven our emphasis on pediatric brain injury work here, we've really benefited so much from some longitudinal studies that have been done largely in collaboration with the Baylor College of Medicine under the leadership of Dr. Harvey Levin, who unfortunately is no longer with us, but has truly been a legend, a guru in the field of brain injury in youth and veterans as well. So these studies started as early as in the late 80s. Dr. Chapman herself became involved at around that time, and moving through here into the last decade. But essentially, what we were doing across these sites was recruiting kids with brain injury at the time of injury. So oftentimes directly from the hospitals or from the community as they were identified. We were able to evaluate them at the time of injury. We really worked hard to gather as much information as we could about these kids prior to the injury. So gleaning a lot of parent and teacher report, try to establish sort of a baseline against which we can compare in their recovery. We also saw it really valuable to gather, psychiatric assessment, doing full clinical interviews to get a sense for their functioning, their family functioning, and then even being able to bring in really cutting-edge brain imaging tools, so both structural and functional imaging, so we could see not only how their brain is responding to this injury, but also how it's responding to treatments and supports. We've also had some that are very focused on interventions, several that I'll be sharing with you today, and then even having the ability to do some more community-based studies where we can better understand how to meet individual needs and the value of advocating for school supports and meeting families where they are. So a lot of our emphasis areas have been on higher order functions. So what I mean, things like executive functioning, so being able to plan, reason, problem solve. Many of us have an emphasis on language and cognition, so using discourse, strategic learning, which I will allude to a bit today. Social cognition, how are these kids able to effectively engage with others and navigate complex social situations? What's their own motivation? How does that translate to their academic achievement? And then, of course, understanding the influence of their brain injury on some of these other serious psychiatric and behavioral outcomes. But perhaps one of my most favorite things to share is this. When we think of one core finding that really was pioneered out of these longitudinal studies, it was this idea that when it comes to brain injury, younger is not necessarily better. So there's very much generally been a school of thought, even within the medical community, that, oh my gosh, kids, they're resilient. Y'all are going to bounce back beautifully. This is so different than maybe what we see in adults, where their life may completely change after an injury. So very much a thought that, oh gosh, you're young. It's good that it happened to you now and not later. Well, what we were really finding is that is not necessarily the truth for a really important reason. And it's this, kind of twofold. One, the prognosis for these kids to really recover function of old skills, things that they acquired prior to the injury, that typically is better in early injury, right? There hasn't been much life that's happened yet. But when we look at the prognosis for acquiring new skills after injury, new learning, that typically is worse after early brain injury. And if you put that in a context, think of a 4-year-old. Think of how much a 4-year-old still has to experience and learn and acquire relative to, say, a 44-year-old. And so if we think about that moving forward impact of the injury, that's where the developing brain can be quite distinct from that of an adult. So if we look at the brain development, neural development that happens during these childhood and adolescent years, it makes sense as to why we see this phenomenon. So what I'm showing you here, this is a classic image from one of the large-scale imaging studies that was done just looking at the typically developing brain, how the brain changes. And what you're seeing between this range of age 5 to age 20, you'll notice the brain becoming more and more blue and purple, right? What that represents is the volume of the gray matter of the brain. So again, this is the part of the brain we picture when we picture our brain and our cortex. And essentially what's happening is as the brain matures, it's being sculpted. Essentially, synaptic pruning is the technical term of the brain is pruning off the extra, the unnecessary. It's essentially becoming more efficient and effective during these years. And so there's sort of these beautiful cycles of synaptic pruning, and it sort of goes from the back of the brain up to the front. So it's really these frontal areas, frontal networks in the brain that are the last to truly refine. And interestingly, if you look sort of under the hood at the white matter, or those underlying connections and pathways in the brain, those actually have a beautiful linear kind of growth across these years in terms of increasing that myelination, allowing those pathways to be more effective in communicating. So the developing brain is a beautiful thing, but also a very vulnerable thing. So ultimately, we wanted to identify through these longitudinal studies really two distinct phases of recovery. So one, that immediate stage, right? If you picture with this graphic the blue trajectory being just typical development, and the red being a child who's had a brain injury, it's easy to see that steep drop-off in function or performance right after the injury. But typically it's followed pretty quickly by an equally dramatic kind of upswing, right? As they are recovering, there's natural healing that happens, and then of course there's wonderful support rehab that's provided in that immediate stage. So it's not unusual to hear amazing stories of recovery and kids really bouncing back beautifully, getting back into the swing of things, and oftentimes sort of this family's having a false sense of, whew, okay, on to the next thing. We are out of the woods with this. Whereas if you really continue to monitor and follow these kids over the following year, 2, 5 plus, what you are likely to see, especially for those kids who experience those more moderate to severe injuries, is what we call a potential neurocognitive stall. This was actually a term that Sandy Chapman herself coined in the literature, this phenomenon of, again, if you think about typically developing kids still having that upward trajectory and achieving these new developmental stages, our kids with brain injury relative to them appear to stall out, such that that gap is getting bigger and bigger between them and their peers. And so it's not that these kids are suddenly regressing or losing skills, so much as that many may be really challenged in taking on some of these new developmental milestones. So new challenges may be harder to overcome. Throw on top of that, again, just the natural brain development that happens during these teenage years, and it really becomes a complicated story. One of my favorite descriptions of the teenage brain is this first one. It's like they've got this incredible engine, this high horsepower, but no steering, right? And that's a typical teen right there. I can speak to this now as the mom of a 13-year-old boy. Absolutely. So again, throw a brain injury into the mix, whether it happened prior to this time or during this time in life, that can really make the story complex, especially because the part of the brain that's really coming online and firing up are these frontal networks during these teenage years that govern all of these important functions, like our ability to critically think, problem solve, have that good judgment, have that emotional regulation. So interestingly, this is a very vulnerable stage, but it's also kind of an optimal stage if we think about the potential for growth and opportunities to take on and try new strategies and really exercise that agency. So again, pediatric TBI, kids are not just little adults. So essentially what you might see is it's like some impairments may appear to get worse over time. Again, not that they're regressing, but that those differences, if you will, between them and their peers might be getting more pronounced. Essentially, some new difficulties can emerge down the road. And at this point, the families may not even be connecting the dots to, say, an injury their child had on the playground at age 5. Essentially, children are having to recover at each new stage of development. It's not a one-time phenomenon. So much we learned even in the process of just identifying this phenomenon. So we really wanted to move into kind of the 2 and 3 objectives with our research. How can we implement some proactive methods for detecting this, helping characterize, monitor, and remediate some of these potential deficits, and then really explore how we can equip them with strategies to facilitate that growth and that real-life function. And we really come at it through a clinical lens. So my professional training is as a speech-language pathologist, so really love bringing in how does language especially help us, serve as a platform to support these higher level skills. So we want to be able to capitalize on strengths while addressing some of these impairments. We want to facilitate activities and participation by helping the child in that acquiring of new skills and strategies. And then we also want to modify some of the contextual factors that might be barriers to their recovery or could help enhance or facilitate their success. So that might also mean identifying or using appropriate accommodations like school supports and so forth. So it truly does take a village. And just to give a quick example, this young man has given us the permission to share his story before, and I think it's a beautiful example of what I just shared. This young man was actually somebody who first came into our sphere when he was injured at the age of 4. So it was actually Sandy Chapman that first became acquainted with this family. This is a boy who was injured. He was crossing the street with his mom and 2 siblings, and essentially a drunk driver plowed through the intersection and hit him. And in fact, it was such a severe impact. His mom shared the story that the police tracked down this driver about 2 hours later, and they still had some of his clothing on the front of the car. Blood alcohol level, I think, was over 3 times the legal limit. One of those just real tragedies. So this young man, again, of course, he actually was in a coma for 3 weeks, was hospitalized or in rehabilitation for 3 months. But, he really had to start all over, with walking and potty training and all of those things. But again, remarkably, was able to actually start school with his same age peers. So remarkable recovery given that incredible support, and honestly was thriving in elementary school, had an incredibly supportive mother, again, was plugged into some of our long-term monitoring. But he is one of these young people who, sure enough, at about age 11, this is when I got to meet him, coming into that middle school age range, and this kiddo was taking a nosedive. Truly, he was starting to really have a lot of challenges, not just academically, but behaviorally, socially, started hanging out with the wrong crowd, started getting into things that just weren't characteristic of this kiddo. And again, we were really fortunate to be plugged in with him and able to not only help better understand some of these challenges, but also how can we support? We even were able to do some short-term kind of direct intervention with him, get him plugged into a good support system, and happy to say when it comes to middle school and high school, really on a positive trajectory. In fact, this is one of my favorite parts of this story. His first job when he was working, I think at age 16 at a grocery store as a clerk there, his very first paycheck, he chose to donate to the center to really continue the research. Again, just speaks to the impact that could be made by really staying connected and supporting families. The last picture is him as a young man, I believe at about age 25 at that point, and was able to graduate high school, start doing some college courses, and presently is living independently. So again, I think just a wonderfully illustrative story of what can happen, but also the possibilities and importance of being proactive. So on to the second part of the story. When we think of brain-based approaches to identifying, characterizing, and supporting these things, one, our bread and butter here at the Center for Brain Health is really cognition. So to narrow the lens there, assessment of cognition after TBI is really complex. Again, for a lot of reasons. One, most children, may improve neurologically in ways that can't be easily predicted. So again, no two people are the same. Therefore, no two recoveries are going to look exactly the same. Also, since they often do recover a great deal of the knowledge and skills that they had acquired prior to the injury, that can sometimes create some confusing or misleading profiles moving forward as we try to figure out, what's truly a challenge area or what's, kind of reflective of their level of functioning before. Trying to unravel that can be tricky. There's also often a real inconsistency in performance as we consider all these other factors that might be at play in their lives, be it neurological, emotional, contextual factors. The strain that a brain injury could put on the family is very significant. So all of that can contribute to some of the difficulties we see. And then that aspect of executive function that is so vulnerable to injury, that can be really difficult to identify or really put a narrow lens on through some of our classic standardized testing and approaches. We really have to kind of do a little bit more assessment in the wild, if you will, to really get a sense for those real life breakdowns or challenges. So one of my favorite visualizations of this complexity or this hierarchy is actually a resource. This is called the building blocks model. It comes out of the Colorado brain injury kind of State Department of Education professional groups there. And what they've demonstrated here is if you look at the bottom of the pyramid, think of these as some fundamental cognitive skills. So things like memory, processing speed, attention, inhibition, even aspects of sensory motor function or response. But another level up in complexity would be what we call intermediate cognitive skills, things like language processes. For example, that calls upon aspects of memory, attention, and so forth. Learning processes. Think about all these different skills you have to call into action to take in, manage, understand, and use information. Another level up from that is putting that to work in these more dynamic contexts, like a social exchange or having to navigate a really challenging problem using your executive functions. And then ultimately at the top of the pyramid is your real life functioning. So, how that translates to your academic achievement or, again, your reasoning in real life. So considering this hierarchy or this kind of building that's being built in terms of cognition, imagine if one has an injury and there might be a particular impact on that fundamental skill of attention. If you take that block out, you really see the impact it has on these higher order skills, right? So again, how do we unravel this and better understand what are the biggest opportunity areas for remediation? So in our work, again, looking at this body of work across these longitudinal studies, these are some of the areas that we found to be particularly sensitive or informative for some of these long-term consequences. So one in particular is this idea of demonstrating inefficient discourse processing. And I will absolutely explain what that means. But essentially, it's, to use the old saying, kids getting so caught up in the trees that they're missing the forest, right? Also decreased problem-solving skills. So again, that executive function and action. Kids who are demonstrating impaired motivation or response to reward, right? Impulsive behavior. Kids who really have challenges with those moving forward aspects of memory, prospective, working memory, again, new learning, manipulating and using information in real time, and then also those kids who are demonstrating maladaptive behavior. So starting to get involved in, aspects that may cause them to be justice involved, for example. So as a speech-language pathologist, let me speak specifically to the value of discourse processing and how we've used that as, again, a tool to give us some insight into these complex functions. Think of discourse processing as just your brain's ability to manage a lot of language at once, right? So interpreting connected language, whether you're reading a story, listening to this lecture, or telling a friend about your weekend. It's a lot of language to work with. So that could include things like story comprehension, having to kind of process the main idea or even central meaning of something, and then understanding what's something that's important for me to focus on versus something that's not. So in the context of kids with brain injury, we've seen that when we use measures that call upon these skills, that's where some of their challenges really become apparent. And particularly for those kiddos that do have some involvement of their frontal networks in terms of their injury. So what that means is, for example, give a child a long text to read, a chapter from their history book, for example, and ask them to summarize it for you. What you're likely to see is either a kid that kind of can't give you much, right? Kind of reducing that amount of information they walked away with. Maybe they're demonstrating a lot of kind of disorganization. What they're telling you isn't really telling a cohesive story. Or they're really kind of walking away, to sort of taking a copy and paste approach to learning and not really able to relay the point, right? Or why this information matters. So one of the ways that all of us really enhance how we process and deal with a lot of information is through a strategic approach to learning. So what we mean is, your brain, even while you're taking this information in, you're extracting what's important while kind of keeping out or blocking what's not, right? Not all of this is something that's gonna land or be important for you. You're holding those ideas in your own working memory, your own kind of workspace in your brain, and then you're synthesizing that in some way. You're putting it in your own words, your own context. You're thinking about those take-home messages that you want to be able to share at the end. This is what we call strategic learning. And essentially, when you think about the brain and cognitive science, we've really learned that we weren't wired fundamentally to be good memorizers. Thank goodness we have other tools to help us store some of those nitty-gritty things like phone numbers, right? We really are most effective. Where we thrive is in our ability to get the meaning, abstract the gist of something, right? Get the essence of it. So the emphasis here is we want to help kids understand it's not about how much you learn, but how efficiently can you really pull out what's important, and in turn, how can you exclude or not crowd your brain with the things that aren't, especially for those who might have, a compromised capacity. So interestingly, if you look at kind of the developmental trajectory of these skills, starting pretty early in school, we really naturally build these abilities. I like this acronym, PICK. We're able to kind of pick what we need to learn. We start by prioritizing what's important, really at about that second or third grade level when we're learning to read and starting to make that transition into reading to learn. As we go through, we start to be better at identifying what's not important. Think about those classic examples like word math problems, right? And throw extraneous information at you, so you have to learn how to get to the pieces you need to solve the problem. Then once we get into those middle school years, they really have to bring in that ability to take those details and turn them into something, a bigger idea. And then ultimately to be able to walk away with some novel meanings and perspectives so that they can apply the information. So we've been really fortunate here at the center to work on measures that are going to put these skills to work and allow us to see how kids are executing them. So one of the tools we developed is called the Test of Strategic Learning. And it involves essentially kids reading through 3 different narratives. They get longer and longer, more loaded with details. But what we're asking them to do is not to memorize them. We're asking them to summarize them. Really put them in your own words. And think about, what is a lesson we can learn from this? What are some take-home messages to extract here? We can also then see, how was their recall for the critical details in these texts, or their ability to kind of make some inferences, answer some why or how questions about it. And then even fundamentally, can they distinguish sort of irrelevant, superfluous, redundant details versus those really critical parts of the text that are needed to understand what it's all about? So when we would execute this with our kids with brain injury, what we found is some interesting patterns. And this was, starting early on, we found that they were really having a hard time putting those summaries together. A lot of our kids would kind of tend to use more of a cut and paste approach. Almost this idea of overcompensating, like, I need to remember everything, so I'm going to start memorizing some phrases in this and sort of just try to piece them together in the end. So many of them were able to condense it to the same degree as their non-injured peers, but they really weren't telling us anything that went beyond just the surface level, even sometimes word for word phrasing in the stories. And interestingly, we saw this not just in our kind of moderate to severe end of the spectrum, but even for our kids with mild TBI. In our early samples, we saw as many as 20% of those kids with mild TBI had comparable difficulties to kids with severe TBI in some of these higher order reasoning skills, even as late as 2 years after their injury. And we saw some interesting relationships with working memory in these skills too. So one of the studies here, for example, we had 20 kids with moderate to severe injury compared to typically developing non-injured children in that 10 to 15 year age range, gave them the test of strategic learning, and our kids with TBI definitely demonstrated that significant impairment in the ability to truly abstract the gist, to really see the forest for the trees. Interestingly, though, they demonstrated a relatively preserved ability to actually recall and encode the details from the text. So what we really think was going on here was an emphasis in our kids with brain injury on a bottom-up approach to processing. So I'm just going to take it all in. Think of if you were to approach a text with a highlighter, ask somebody to highlight what's important. These kids had a solid yellow page, right? So they're not inhibiting, they're selecting everything, and that puts a strain on the brain. In fact, overwhelms the brain such that it's really hard to think deeply about something or read between the lines or see the bigger picture when you're really just trying to memorize those word-for-word details. And in turn, it can really impact some of those other higher order functions that are going to need these skills. So what can we do about it? In the time we have remaining, I want to speak a little bit to how we tackle remediating this. So think about neuroplasticity, right? It's provided a lot of hope for the ability to reorganize, take on new functions that are going to allow you to address some of these aspect. So we use this idea of strategic learning as a way in on that. So think about giving kids the ability to take a lot of information in, come away with not only the what, but also the so what, and even the now what. And it was exciting. With the very first time we tried this with a couple of kids who had had severe injury at an early age. One of these, in fact, is the young man I told the story about. And, did this sort of approach to assessment with them and saw, sure enough, they could remember the details pretty easily. But when you looked at their summaries, wow, they were really stuck in the word for word. So to working with them, in this case, it was about 10 days spread out, about an hour each time, worked on things like making inferences, how to paraphrase information, how to build that ability to summarize and abstract. And we really started to see the fruits of that, of their work at that post-testing. A lot more evidence of inferencing, in particular in their summaries. And these kids did some of our early brain imaging at the time too. These are kind of crude images nowadays, but you could already start to see that they were recruiting more areas, some of these nearby neurons, if you will, to perform these same tasks, given some of these tools. When we did this with a bigger group of kids, at least on the imaging side, we were already seeing even some distinctions in terms of those kids who had good strategic discourse recovery, really demonstrating more right frontal activation, versus those kids that were experiencing more persistent challenges, activating a different area in the brain. So it essentially made us think, one, okay, are we onto something that's going to help really inform this neurocognitive stall? But more importantly, is this something we could translate into intervention to not just train these particular skills, but hopefully see that trickle-down effect to some of the other skills that are called upon, like working memory and inhibition, and then seeing how they can put that to work for their real-life function and even change their brain in the process. So essentially, as we've learned how the brain works, we're better able to inform these neurocognitive treatment development and even thinking about educational teaching strategies to support not only students with brain injury, but all students. So our mantra was, we're going to go top down. And what we mean by that is, since these kids are opting to go bottom up, kind of let the environment guide their learning and action, let's help them be more in the driver's seat, right, of how they learn. And so we're really pulling from cognitive and neural evidence the value of something that's goal-oriented, something that you have to put into action. So we're helping the child develop and use cognitive strategies to engage these processes and these areas in the brain. And this is, a different approach than going bottom up when it comes to remediation, where you might be drilling a specific skill like memory, for example. And there were some wonderful models for us to look at, especially in the brain injury literature, things like goal management training, problem-solving training, where you're helping people start at the top, identify their goal, and break that down into manageable steps. So we took a similar tactic with what we call our SMART training, strategic memory advanced reasoning training, but it's really emphasizing these executive function skills. Let's help these kids recognize their ability to neuroengineer their brain while supporting these really high-level skills. So I always seek to help kids recognize their personal agency in this, having that proactive mindset. This is an opportunity to grow, and having some performance tools. So the way that looks for our kids with brain injury, typically, I'd meet with them for, say, 8 to 10 training sessions over a 4 to 5 week period. Would really focus on these skills like strategic attention, let's filter so that you can focus, integrated reasoning or really big picture thinking, and then ultimately that innovation, being able to take multiple perspectives. So one of my favorite kind of entrees into this approach is that idea of blocking. So really blocking in important information before you focus on key points, and then it allows you to better look for themes, summarize as you go, Again, see the forest. So really quick, I want to give you all an example of this, an adult example. This is not something I would show a 10-year-old, but if you had to take in and interpret what this piece of text is telling us, this is probably not an easy task for anybody here. We might have some attorneys in the room, I know we do, who could do this more quickly, but oh my gosh, is anybody overwhelmed yet? Right? In fact, what really bugs me is there's no period. Wow, but what if I did this? Okay, I could breathe a little more easily now. Look what I've done. And thankfully an attorney helped us do this, but we blocked out the stuff that's really kind of redundant, not so critical, a bunch of legalese, if you will, but ultimately this is so much more manageable. And it makes it easier for me to now really just distill it down to its essence. What do I really need to know from this contract in this case? These are the skills, the practical real-life skills we want to help these kids build. And we've been able to show that that's possible. One of our intervention trials, this is with 20 teenagers who are at least 6 months out. We really had great success with this. In fact, we saw significant gain, not just in their ability to get the gist, but also their ability to remember the details in the process. So essentially reinforcing that idea of that trickle-down benefit. And it's beautiful to see what they can do when given the tools to really capture those deeper meanings and the influence on other fundamental skills, working memory, inhibition, and even this bottom one is lowering in terms of showing fewer real-life executive function challenges, which is a good thing. We were even able to translate this to a virtual delivery. So this was actually pre-pandemic. We were using Skype, but we were able to sort of replicate or have a parallel where we were showing gains with that approach as well. And then this approach has been used across many different populations, not just brain injury here. I've only highlighted a few that I think are particularly relevant to our adolescents. But essentially, we're trying to target these executive functions as well as these wonderful processes that support them. And in fact, in order to leave some time for questions, I'm going to leave y'all with this quote that I think is really, really meaningful. One of the gurus of the adolescent brain had this to say in an editorial several years ago. He said, one of the most useful skills for children and adolescents to acquire is going to be this ability to effectively use this universe of information. So we have to be able to critically evaluate the data. We know how important that is in this information age. We have to discern signal from noise, what's important, what's not. We have to be able to synthesize it and apply it. And that is something that is a goal really for anybody with the brain, but a real area for enhancing function resilience for our kids with brain injury. So I'm going to zoom forward real quick to my take-home messages for y'all. So again, reiterating, kids are not just little adults. So we really want to be proactive, not just reactive in our approach. And there really is value in taking more of a top-down approach in our assessment, in our interventions, for that more widespread functional impact. And in fact, strategies, giving kids tools for how they approach their learning, how they approach navigating complex social situations, help them see the big picture so they can understand the steps that they need to take. This is huge in allowing them to really realize meaningful goals and just emphasizing there are so many pathways to support your brain health and your resilience. So thank you for your attention today. So many people to acknowledge in this work over the years, but ultimately would welcome your own questions and perhaps even your own take-home messages.
Awesome, awesome. One takeaway, and I get to ask the first question. So it kind of explains something to me because I was thrown off the roof a lot as a kid with my brothers. So younger isn't better, but it explains some things. You talked about the difference in terms of this stall period after an injury with kids. Is there a difference between kids and adults in terms of their after-injury resilience, even though we're recognizing that stall? Because we've learned the brain remains plastic, so is Is there a special problem you have with kids in resilience and recovery, or is it similar to what we see with adults?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's interesting depending on what kind of symptom domain you look at as well. Obviously, I've focused a lot on the cognitive domain and those kind of spillover impacts to functioning in education and real life. One interesting part of the story in physical recovery, so to speak to resilience there, we do see that kids tend to have a lot more positive prognosis when it comes to their physical recovery than, say, an injury to an adult. So, for example, it's one reason why so often, even these kids who've had really severe injuries, for example, a kid who's been in a car accident is likely to have also had other physical injuries too. Oftentimes make remarkable physical recoveries such that essentially you often hear of brain injury being the invisible injury, right? Not physically, you can't see that they've had an injury to the brain because physically so often they recover so well. That is particularly true for kids, and unfortunately makes it even more complicated, right, for folks to understand why they're continuing to have challenges because you can't physically see them.
Awesome. From the crowd, Paige. There's two.
My take home is that I knew none of this.
Okay.
And I was of the school thought that children are resilient and they'll fix it. So as a person who has two small children, one of whom was in the ER not too long ago for a head injury, I'm just curious if you have any strategies to advocate for better diagnosis in those situations. I can tell you firsthand, they told me specifically, kids are good at bouncing back. Let us know if he vomits. Like that was the advice for follow-up.
Okay.
Can you talk about better advocacy strategies in those moments, especially in urgent cares and ERs that are packed with other things?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, so for the virtual audience, if you need to hear that too, how can we really equip parents, I think especially for better advocating for their kids, especially for those young kids in that hospital context. I think you're already onto something, which is the point of not being afraid to be a squeaky wheel. Like, okay, I know how to address this, but what about the brain? Like, and really taking, and this is the unfortunate part of the story, is parents often, you have to take it upon yourself to be vigilant in terms of making sure there is follow-along care, right? The good news is, and I want to make sure that that message is heard too, more often than not, especially in the case of mild TBI or concussion, the chances for a very, very positive recovery, especially given the right management and support, is huge, And so we don't want that message to be lost, right? The last thing, and I think, about 5 to 10 years ago, we saw this interesting pendulum swing in the world of concussion where it used to be that nobody talked about it, kind of the fight through it, don't report kind of thing. And then suddenly it's all anybody was talking about. And I think the reaction was almost too extreme, right? We need to put them in a dark room for weeks on end. And we were actually seeing the consequences of that as well. So kind of bringing the conversation to, all right, the main thing we know is that we want to be proactive, to speak up, to make sure that there's some sort of follow-along care, but also being very hopeful of the process, that there's a lot you can do. So quite frankly, just the fact that you recognize that you are an advocate for your child, I think is really key. And in general, again, the medical community is more and more aware of this now than they ever have been, even in the school context. We actually have some amazing states that are essentially model systems for how to facilitate that continuity, so you know what to do at school and so forth. But yeah, each child is different, so it makes sense that you're going to need to advocate for your child's needs.
Hi, Lori. I have a two-pronged question. The first one is, have there been attempts to record participants who go through your research project where they get taught the SMART techniques after traumatic brain injury to see if their gains are sustainable over time? So that's, I guess, part one. And part two is, after the participants complete the training of the SMART curriculum, do you also go back and connect the gains in their ability to produce GIST statements to other metrics of executive function or general well-being? I think you had a slide with, 3 particular measures, but are there other extensive attempts to correlate gains in GIST to other measures?
Yeah, thank you. So to the first part of the question, the idea of maintenance of gains. This is something I would love to be able to dig into a little bit more. So not just having longitudinal studies that look at general recovery, but longitudinal recoveries that look at maintenance of gains or the value of, this kind of boosters. What does that look like in the long run? While we don't have, formal studies that have looked at that a lot in our youth with brain injury in terms of the intervention maintenance of gains, we have a lot of those kind of individual cases where that's been really successful. At the adult level, so one of our randomized clinical trials here was with adults with brain injury, community dwelling adults, many of whom were veterans. And these were folks that were, on average, about 8 years out from their injury, and they underwent SMART training, or they were randomized into more of kind of a brain education intervention. And they saw gains that not only were, very evident right after the training, but were really sustained 3 months, even 6 months down the road. And then even looking at the neural correlates that really supported that change. So I'm really encouraged by what we're seeing in adults in terms of how that translates to youth, but definitely an area we would love to pursue systematically. Yeah. And yeah, that trickle-down effect, some of the core areas we measured are things like working memory, inhibition, cognitive flexibility, and then how that translates to real-life executive function, behavior, and social engagement as well.
Awesome. Let's give it up for Dr. Cook. Homegrown here at Center for Brain Health. So we always do learn something at these. So thank you again. So remember, lifelong brain health is our mission. So we do look at brain health from start to finish rather than life or death. That sounds a little more optimistic, doesn't it? So thank you again for being here, virtual audience as well as the local audience. We'll see you again on Friday, March 22nd, where we'll hear from Dr. Michael Thout, and he's going to be talking about advances and new perspectives in clinical music neuroscience and neurologic music therapy, something I think we'll all enjoy. So thank you again.